Ideology is present in every piece of media, intentional or otherwise. An audience picks up on this directly or subconsciously through the codes and conventions used to present a certain idea. Let's explore how this is achieved.
We'll never abandon you.
Sound of Metal, directed by Darius Marder and released in 2019, depicts the journey of a young drummer who suddenly experiences a rapid deterioration of his hearing. The premise of the movie is based around learning to live with deafness rather than attempting to fix it. Throughout history, there has been very poor representation of those with disabilities, often making them the villain, butt of the joke, or an unfeeling character. More recently, there has been a shift in awareness which has allowed greater visibility of people with disabilities, mostly due to knowledge made accessible through the internet. Despite this, our society is still strongly rooted in ableism, and so ableism remains a dominant ideology today. After gradually losing his hearing, protagonist Ruben acclimatized to his new situation and found his place amongst the deaf community. However, he hadn't reached complete acceptance. There is an important scene which precedes the one I'm about to discuss, where Ruben receives his cochlear implants. The scene is told through the point of hearing. The extreme distortion of the audio evokes a sense of discomfort to the audience, particularly a hearing audience.
Oh, sounds like nerd.
And this paired with the artificial harsh lighting of the clinic suggests the idea that the surgery is unnatural. This scene follows Ruben's surgery when he goes to ask Joe, his mentor, for money, contributing to the convention of a stereotypical addict, depicted by Riz Ahmed's desperate pleading, which soon becomes resentment as he is denied.
From where I'm sitting, you look and sound like an addict.
This convention can be seen in 2006 film Candy, directed by Neil Armfield, which shows two characters begging for money from their guardian. This convention positions the audience to feel empathy and is used to steer the narrative by clearly highlighting the characters' motivations and vulnerabilities. The five-act structure of this film is based on the convention of 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. At this point of the film, Ruben is presented with a fork in the road, to get the surgery or not, which will push the plot forwards to reach the final stage, acceptance. This convention is also seen in The Babadook, where a poltergeist takes the form of the anger our protagonist has been harboring following the death of her husband, exploring the different ways in which grief manifests. This convention is seen in a variety of other narratives, such as Beautiful Boy, Requiem for a Dream, and There Will Be Blood. In this scene, there is a clear contrast between the characters, which represent the two different choices that a person without hearing can make. Joe, who chose to accept his lack of hearing, is dressed up in a button-up that presents the image of a put-together man, enhanced by his calm manner in the face of Ruben's frustration. Additionally, he is illuminated by natural light that is seen in almost all scenes of the deaf community, constructing a representation of the community as natural and kind. On the other hand, Ruben is dressed in all black and in baggy clothing to illustrate that he remains in the depression stage of grief. His beanie covers the evidence of his surgery, suggesting he is somewhat ashamed of his decision. Marder intended for these codes to convey the idea that a handicap isn't something to be fixed, by juxtaposing these two characters.
Ruben, as you know, everybody here shares in the belief that being deaf is not a handicap, not something to fix.
The reception from hearing audiences on the movie was largely positive, praising the multifaceted perspective on having a disability in America. The praise focused on how it critiques the American healthcare system, hence the almost unattainable cochlear implant surgery. However, members of the deaf community had varied reviews. Firstly, the casting of hearing actors as the lead roles, with only minor characters being given to deaf actors, was received with some backlash. Additionally, and more specific to this scene, many people were frustrated by the fork in the road convention Ruben was faced with. Ren, a deaf cultural critic, asked, "Why perpetuate that it's either resigning yourself to an isolated world or being a traitor with cochlear implants? We are so beyond this argument." She argues that it presents a grim and unrealistic black and white reality, devoid of hope. Other members of the community found it moving and an accurate representation of their personal journeys, and were excited for a film that finally provided representation and a sense of community. A source of conflict in the reception of the movie was that it catered to the hearing gaze, as the use of audio, both in its volume and distortion, was a major code used throughout the movie to create atmosphere and provide context. Due to the nature of feature films being sync audio-visual, the movie relied on audio codes to convey meaning, something which ensured the narrative was not entirely accessible to members of the deaf community. Specifically in this scene, were the frustrated tone of voice used by Ruben with varying levels of volume.
Give me the money. Okay.
Compared to Joe's calm manner of speaking.
From where I'm sitting, you look and sound like an addict.
Provided important context to the scene. Many members of the deaf community argue that this is therefore not a piece of media designed for those without hearing, and its catering towards a hearing audience is disrespectful. Another film which presented an emerging ideology is The Silence of the Lambs.
Thank you, Clarice. Thank you.
The 1991 film directed by Jonathan Demme tells the story of a young woman in the FBI who works to track down a serial killer, while dealing with the obstacles presented by sexism in the workplace and everyday life. There were few movies with female leads at this time, and those films, such as Fatal Attraction, would link a woman's independence to her sex appeal or lack of responsibility. Therefore, women were rarely represented in a capable manner, making this film groundbreaking. The scene I will discuss is when our protagonist Clarice Starling first meets her quasi-mentor Hannibal Lecter, a captive serial killer. The construction of the movie prior to this scene clearly illustrates the harassment experienced by women in the workplace, and the ways in which Clarice is objectified by co-workers and rivals alike. Clarice is obliged to entertain Dr. Chilton's flirting in order to get the opportunity that any male agent would be granted immediately. The line of eyesight between characters also presents the idea of the male gaze, as the men stare at her with obvious interest, much as one would stare at an animal in a zoo. Additionally, even her superior puts her down in front of her co-workers. However, Clarice's reaction to this particular scene portrays her as a strong individual, hurt by the myriad of sexism she faces but rising above it. The narrative convention of a fish out of water is used to highlight Clarice's sense of isolation in a male-dominated workplace, illustrated by her movement against the flow of the crowd and the camera angles which place her below her male co-workers, also an indicator of status. This convention is used in many films such as Legally Blonde, where the main character is isolated from her co-workers by her gender and ideals, illustrated through costuming and acting. At the beginning of the scene where Clarice meets with Lecter, she passes various other criminals, all men. The build-up of aggression from each inmate serves to highlight Hannibal Lecter's dangerous nature. But despite Demme's intentions, a different reading of this scene could be interpreted as the various types of sexism that still exists: willful ignorance, leering, and outright hatred. When Clarice comes face to face with Lecter, his commanding nature and facade of civility creates the perfect depiction of male chauvinism. While Lecter is often praised by the audience as the sole male in the film who doesn't objectify Clarice, the dialogue in this scene suggests otherwise. Lecter makes a variety of jokes loaded with sexual innuendos for the sake of making Clarice uncomfortable. While he points out some flaws of the patriarchal society, he does so at the expense of Starling. Demme includes a scene where Clarice discusses the case with her friend Ardelia. This is one of very few scenes where Clarice is positioned on the same level as another person, indicating the power dynamics between the two are even. Through these various codes, Demme exposes the reality of the sexism faced by women in the workplace, which remains relevant today, with discussions of the gender pay gap and more recent feminist movements. The reception of this film has varied significantly over time between its year of release in 1991 and its more modern interpretation. The second wave of feminism was occurring at the time of release as an emerging ideology. This wave focused primarily on refuting traditional gender roles, which relate specifically to the introduction of women in male-dominated spaces, such as law enforcement. Therefore, at the time, it was a revolutionary film, encouraging women to take back their agency and overcome the obstacles they face from patriarchal society. This was reflected in the statistics of women in the FBI, which increased after the release of the film, from only 11 women in 1971 to approximately 2,675 today. Feminists such as Elizabeth Young and the majority of feminists at the time perceived it as an exposure of the male gaze, inciting evaluation onto the sexist nature of film. During this scene, Lecter maintains eye contact with fervor and intensity, further illustrated by the close-up shots when Lecter stares directly into the barrel of the lens. This direct gaze places the audience in the shoes of the protagonist, evoking fear and allowing the audience to relate to the scrutiny Clarice faces daily. This point-of-view shot and use of close-ups is a characteristic often used in feature films for the purpose of empathizing with the character. However, there was a conflict of views in 1991, as other feminists such as Betty Friedman saw the victims of antagonist Buffalo Bill as a distraction from the feminism present, instead presenting the evisceration and skinning alive of women, something that has been consistently fetishized in media up until this day. More modern readings criticize the film's feminist ideals for different reasons. After progressive movies with strong female leads have been released more recently, reflections on the older movie revealed that Starling has a strong reliance on Lecter. Many modern third and fourth wave feminists interpret this movie to be conveying the message that women are unable to succeed without the help of a man. This change reading was a result of further feminist movements, including the later waves and other historical moments such as protests on the gender pay gap, the Me Too movement, and the introduction of social media as an accessible political platform. A further critique exposes the film for barely passing the Bechdel test, with the majority of lead roles being men and the majority of female characters being victims. Third and fourth wave feminism is centered around the idea of intersectionality, rather than the previous waves which were centered around white feminism. Therefore, the transphobic presentation of Buffalo Bill, which associated transsexualism with violence, as well as the law enforcement, a system which has consistently persecuted people of color and women of color, being depicted in heroic light, was deemed to be backwards and conservative and a direct opposition to more recent feminist theories. Overall, directors use a combination of codes and conventions to present an ideology, emerging or dominant. However, despite the ways in which they convey this, many films are interpreted differently, and readings may depend on the biases of the viewer, including their personal experiences, socio-political status, beliefs, and a variety of other factors.